So today's webinar very much focused around energy performance contracting. And I suppose the first presentation that I'm going to give is on redefining energy performance contracting. And that's very much the theme of what we're looking at today. Like, how do we, it's been around a long time. A lot of us have talked for a long time. Why do we think it's the new answer to our problems? So we're hopefully going to explain that. Then Emily's going to talk a bit about the suitability and implementation of EPCs. And then Aaron will talk about some very good contracting funding and support scheme that's there in terms of helping getting projects off the ground. And then we'll have a very short Slido after that, and then hopefully a good Q&A session. But as always, if you think of questions, later on during the week or whatever, we're always happy to answer them. So then just getting into it. So just like to start by just introducing Codema. We're energy advisors to the 4 Dublin local authorities. We're founded in 1997 as a not-for-profit organisation. There's currently 34 of us working in Temple Bar. We offer services in energy monitoring and management, energy awareness, policy and planning, project management, and funding. And we also act as performance contracting facilitators. So what exactly is EPC, or energy performance contracting? Well, basically, a kind of a definition that we got from one of the early European projects, and I think a very solid one, is that it's simply the provision of energy services with a guaranteed outcome. So there's loads of variations of EPC across Europe, and it can become very, very confusing when you're trying to understand how all the different contracts work. But basically, if it doesn't satisfy this statement, then it's not really EPC. So I think it's quite a good one for that. And when we talk about EPC, we're essentially saying that we want to move away from this kind of traditional contracting model, or this business as usual, where the building owner is basically at the center of everything, making all the decisions and in full control. And from that point of view, it's very good. It's an approach we all know very well. The building owner is in full control and everybody answers to them. But as a consequence of this, you end up taking all the risks. So if there's an increased cost of works, if there's an operation performance risk after, and one which probably overlooked is that system integration risk. So if we're putting a heat pump into an old building, how is it going to all function together as one system? And so from that point of view, we see this kind of inefficient, and that doesn't consider the efficiency of the overall building energy system. And so that's kind of the standard model. And we want to move from that to this, which is basically, it's a design, build, operate, and maintain. And the operate and maintain bit is very important. I know some people have done design build before and maybe not liked it, but you're looking at kind of cradle to grave here. So whoever's designing it is going to operate and maintain it, and that tends to focus the attention. And it's basically a kind of public-private partnership, or could be called energy performance contract. They're all kind of slightly different versions of the same thing. All we have done here, if you look carefully, is rearrange the contractual relationships between all of the different players involved, but we also have service and maintenance brought into it as well. So basically wrapping up these is what we call an ESCO, or an energy services company, another term that's used a lot and has many different meanings, but that's what we're talking about here. And they deal directly with the building owner, and then we have a facilitator. So that's just to kind of to paint a picture of what EPC really looks like in practice. There is another kind of in-between version that we will talk about today called the Energy Performance Guarantee. And this is basically a traditional contract with a performance guarantee clause. And Emily will explain a little bit about what we mean about performance guarantees later and give some examples. But it is a good addition. This is something we see is very good for single technology projects, or if you have small buildings. So in this, we've separated out the design because you can't have lots of people competing on the design. And then you try and wrap everything else up with one building contractor. Very similar to the traditional local authorities of full control. It's traditional, everybody knows this. You can bring in a performance guarantee, which is very good. but the same kind of cons there as the traditional approach is that the local authorities take in all that design and cost risk, and that the performance is limited in comparison to guarantee is limited in comparison to an EPC, and then there's higher upfront costs. And then I just want to touch a little bit about EPC and policy support, both at a national and European level. So the Energy Services Directive, Article 5, talks about the exemplary role of public bodies in buildings. And here it specifically mentions energy performance contracting as a kind of route to your projects. Unfortunately, it does mention it in relation to financing, which I think is misguided, which I'll talk about later. But it's also reflected then in the Climate Action Plan under retrofitting and improving energy efficiency in public sector buildings. And then it's also mentioned again in the National Development Plan under public-private partnerships and energy performance contracts. So there is a kind of a policy or context support for it. As part of the DeliveREE project, which is the project we're working on now with the Dublin local authorities, myself and Emmy conducted 14 interviews with EPC experts across Europe. And the results are summarized in this report, which you can find on our website. But I suppose the main outcomes in terms of barriers, because we always seem to look at barriers, was that we found that there's, the usual ones. There's a lack of scale and standardization in how we apply EPC, which means that you can have high project development and procurement costs. There's limited project and finance offerings, which is a kind of a bit of a chicken and egg. There's not the finance products out there for EPC projects because there's not enough projects, and the projects are not going forward because maybe the finance instruments are not there. So that's one. A more surprising one that we found is that there really is a lack of a shared understanding of all the terms around EPC. So even terms like ESCO and EPC itself and the guarantee, and we're all using the same words, but they don't necessarily have the same meaning. So that's something that we really need to tackle and kind of agree in some standard definitions. And then a key barrier then is around the level of ambition when it comes to projects, that there's an option generally to opt for more single technology projects, like just focusing on putting in the heat pump or putting on the solar panels, and not looking at the more holistic building level, because when you're using traditional contract structures, that can get quite complex. So that is a barrier. When we're putting this presentation together, and that analysis, it kind of brought back to memory a report we did back in 2016 for another European project called EESI 2020, where we also looked at barriers. And here we find that the most prevalent barrier was, again, lack of knowledge, understanding within the public, private and financing sector, leading to long time frames for EPC implementation and lack of sustainable finance. So a carbon copy. And it kind of got me thinking, like, I was also in Frankfurt and at a UNESCO conference last year, and they were essentially talking about the same barriers and the same solutions. So I felt we were kind of missing the point, or something was wrong. So I started to think about how EPC is normally communicated. And you could see even in the Energy Services Directive, it was in relation to finance. So EPC is normally sold as an alternative method of funding a project. The focus is primarily on installing new equipment and technology, and the focus is on installing all the measures like during an initial works phase. So almost treating these retrofit projects or imagining them to be more like new build projects, where it's a blank slate and you go in and you put on lots of measures. And, on the face of it, that seems okay. But really what I think here is that we have a performance contract kind of product, to call it something that more answers the needs of the ESCO industry and the finance industry in Europe in particular, because a lot of that is driven from there. And I think there's an imbalance then, and that it's not really considering the real needs of the building owner. And especially now as we're starting to focus on decarbonisation. So I feel we really need to change our perspective and consider the real needs and drivers of the building owner, which kind of led to this work that we're kind of doing and pursuing now in DeliveREE. So just to take these kind of 3 points of that, how EPC is currently sold, and just go through them. So starting with the finance, then we'll look at the new equipment, and then we'll look at that kind of all the equipment or a deep retrofit and see what they mean. So in terms of EPC as an alternative funding mechanism, so the most common answer to why EPC is it's an alternative finance mechanism. It's everywhere, always, and it's always included in the presentations in EPC are always included in the finance section of all conferences. But I think, so is this the only reason to use EPC? No. Is it the main reason to use EPC? I would say no. And if you have funding, so you have all the money, you don't need any alternative finance coming in from ESCO, is EPC redundant? Absolutely not. And what I would say in terms from a building owner perspective, that the real benefits of EPC are the kind of the one face to the client. So you can see here in the graphic, on one side, or the graphic I showed you at the beginning, you're a building owner, you're dealing with multiple contractors, and that's okay, but it might be a lot easier, especially if you don't have really core technical staff in-house to be dealing with an ESCO and pushing off some of that risk. It really brings maintenance into the question, which is often neglected. Risk sharing, most important, that you're passing over that technical risk, especially around design, over to the party is best placed to manage it, the technical ESCO. And then crucially, there's a guarantee of performance, which brings in some value for money. And then there is also the possibility of bringing in alternative financing. But I think that those other four kind of are more important. If we look at just the whole idea of just focusing on installing new technology, so a lot of EPCs will try and just maintain and look after the kit they put in as an EPC and draw a line around that and ignore all the existing energy systems within a building. But if we just focus on new technology, which is very attractive, but I don't think it'll solve our decarbonisation problems. And I think this is quite proved by this Innovate UK report in January 2016, where they followed 50 low energy design buildings. So NZ buildings, BREEAM Excellent, all the labels, they had a range of them, I think. And they were funded under Innovate UK. They followed them for 5 years, and they found that there was a performance gap of 3.5. So that on average, those buildings were consuming 3.5 times more energy per meter squared than their label or rating said they would. And if you look at this in terms of CO2, we see that there's one building on this list or this chart that is about 1.25. All the rest are twice. So 2 times the CO2 emissions per meter squared per year than the label says. And these are all brand new, best technology, efficient buildings. So, and they're just, and the problem is that you can't just put in the technology and hope it'll do everything for you. You have to
I think we may have just lost Joe. Joe?
Yes.
We just lost you there for a second.
Oh, okay. I just see that. So what bit did you lose?
Yeah. If you could start that again.
I'll do that slide again. Okay. So yeah, just tell me if I might switch off the cameras if it happens again. But basically, this chart shows that these buildings that were followed by Innovate UK are on average emitting twice the CO2 emissions per meter squared than their rating or label says they should. And performance contracting can really help close this gap, because these are brand new buildings with the best technology. It's really the issue here is how they're being operated. So they should all be at one. And then the other point was around all the measures being installed at once up front. And this one kind of would call the deep retrofit challenge. So according to the Building Performance Institute of Europe, to achieve our targets, deep renovation should reach 3% per year as soon as possible. And that by 2030, 70% of renovations taking place should be deep. But the current deep renovation rate in Europe is only 0.2%. And why? Essentially, we've been talking about this for a long time. And I kind of feel it's because deep retrofit it's not always practical for an active building or a live building. And that there's no good time to shut down all or half of your building so you can do energy efficiency upgrades to it. And I think within that, underlying that, is that energy efficiency alone will never be the main driver for deep retrofits, because the core function is always more important. So we're always relying on maybe there's the glazing all has to be replaced because the building's uncomfortable, or the roof is leaking and it has to be replaced, and then it's like it makes sense to do a lot more, or else the internal layout of the building is no longer fit for purpose for whatever that core function is, be it a hospital or a school or whatever, and then you'll take the opportunity to do the deep retrofit. And I think that's the reality. So what I see happening at the moment is there's a kind of a paralysis around this, in that where the deep retrofit challenge is so great that we're almost doing nothing. And I think the bit in the middle that we need to do is decarbonisation, and we can do that in live buildings, and EPC can fulfill that gap. Deep retrofit will always be the best solution, but we don't have time to wait for it to all happen, I think. So taking all this into account, through our work in DeliveREE, we feel that redefining EPC so that it recognizes the building owner's needs, so they have safe, comfortable, low carbon, efficient buildings. So looking at the outputs, what you want. A better focus on service, so operation and maintenance of the complete energy system, so both the old and the new. So while some new equipment will be installed, you also want somebody to make sure that's integrated with the existing systems in there and make sure it all works together in a more harmonious way. And then I think crucially, it's this idea of a continuous improvement or a pathway to zero carbon, where deep retrofit is not viable straight away. So I'll touch on this again. I think that's quite important, especially for public sector buildings and public sector targets. And then, of course, there's the guaranteed de-risk performance or value for money. So getting back to where we started, why do we feel EPC is so important now? What has changed? And basically, I feel what has changed is the introduction of the climate action plan targets, especially for the public sector. And I'm assuming, because this went out over Energy Link, that we have mainly public sector audience here. So basically now you're in a situation, you must decarbonize your buildings to achieve your targets. So electrification, biomass, district heating, if it's available, which is limited at the moment. Focus on decarbonization of heat. So no more oil and gas. And the reason why we really have to focus on heat is because the electricity grid will more or less be taken care of for us. And we're looking to electrify in most cases anyway. So as the way we see it is, you have two choices. You can either go about this by looking at individual measures and focus on it by technology, or you can consider whole building holistic decarbonization. Individual decarbonization measures, very much in terms of it's easy. You can use traditional contracting procurement models. Am I frozen again? No, get the warning. So yeah, so you can use familiar, you can trusted approach, what we know best. As I pointed out earlier, this is our performance guarantee. Essentially, we can put in a clause there to guarantee some outcomes, shorter procurement, and we feel this is best for small buildings and single technology projects. But the cons are that it's not holistic, so energy saving opportunities will be missed. So in small buildings, this is less significant. It'll only address new systems generally. There'll be higher upfront costs because you have to do your design and take those risks up front. There's a limited guarantee compared to EPC. The design and cost risk is with the building owner. And one that's often missed is that it's repeated procurement. You're going to go to procurement for every measure generally, because bundling measures using these contract models are a little bit more difficult, or bundling buildings. Where the whole building decarbonization approach is what we're kind of calling EPC essentially. It's more holistic in that it optimizes those new and existing systems. You get guaranteed CO2 savings. And then with that, we can put buildings on a contracted pathway to zero. And next slide, I'll go through that, what we mean by that. There's once-off procurement. Again, so the opposite of that. So you might be getting a 8-year or 10-year contract, but you're only going to procure once. And you have that contractor then on board, unless you're not happy with what they're doing, and then you retain the right to go back out to the market again. But you don't have to every time. So that can allow for better planning. This is what we see as best for large complex buildings. It also allows for pooling of buildings, so putting 3 or 4 buildings together, as we're doing with the Dublin local authorities. I would say there's lower upfront costs because you're bringing the ESCOs in to help do the design, and then you're generally paying them off in monthly payments over the term of the contract. And it can bring in finance. The cons are that it is longer procurement, but as I said, you're doing it years of procurement at once. I suppose big one that people will always focus on is the contractor or ESCO takes a share of the savings that come up. But they have to be realized, first for that to happen. But that is definitely a thing. There are longer contracts. It can be a positive in terms of providing a structure, as we'll see with Pathway to Zero. And probably the biggest one, and might be overlooked, but you should be well placed to do, is that the contract must be managed over a long period of time. So you have to remember it and manage it and look after it and preserve the relationship. They mentioned the Pathway to Zero a couple of times, and I feel this is one of the most important features of EPC for the public sector when it comes to decarbonising buildings and achieving our climate action plans. So basically, EPC allows us to plan a phased decarbonisation of our buildings. So a set of measures that we can implement over time. So, we're looking at EPC, it provides the contract structure for a planned phased decarbonisation of buildings. So this allows for the phasing out of existing assets like boilers and CHPs in there, because as mentioned at the beginning, the current impression of EPC, it almost treats buildings like a new building, but our existing buildings are anything but. They're a mixture of equipment of varying quality and varying age. Some is about to fall over tomorrow, other has only been put in 4 years ago, and it's anything but a clean slate. So for example, we have CHPs in the Dublin leisure centres now that are 8 years old. They probably have another 8 years in them. We don't want to get the contractors coming up. Do we get rid of them now? Probably not, but yet we do want to decarbonise as well. So what an EPC would allow us to do is to put in a plan for maybe phasing them out in, say, 5 years and sweating them out in the meantime, getting the most out of them. But knowing that they were going to be replaced with heat pumps or something after that. So I think that is a very important element. And with that, you can use the ESCO or the EPC contractor to prepare an implementation plan with the building, because they're going to be there for a period of time. They can get invested in it. And then that allows you as a building owner to prepare a kind of a structured investment plan to put with that. So to create certainty around budgets for the coming time. And then it's a single procurement competition. I put that in because it's always perceived as being difficult and complex, and it's not. So basically, in kind of summary, the EPC, it gives us that structured pathway to zero. It's contracted and it's guaranteed CO2 reduction, measured and verified every month according to an international measurement and verification protocol. And I think it very much helps to simplify and de-risk what is a really complex and dynamic process when you get into existing buildings and there's so many moving parts and different bits. So just to conclude, we talked about different versions, and you could be wondering now, well, is it EPC or do we do performance guarantee? Do we look at whole building or individual measures? And the answer really is it's going to be a mixture of both for all of you. You're going to have some big buildings, which we would recommend going towards EPC, smaller ones, which it just doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense. But then you should definitely be looking at a performance guarantee. So that guarantee is the one thing we'd really like you to take away from this. So Emily now will present more on the kind of strategies we've developed as part of DeliveREE to try and untangle this knot of what buildings to go in what direction, and to help answer some of these questions and give some more examples. So I think that's it for me. So I'll stop sharing now, Emily, and hand it over to you.
Thanks,
I think
Joe.
we'll take all the questions at the end. So sorry, I've lost my mouse.
Okay, I'll just share my
Can you
screen.
just share, take over?
Yeah. Can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Yep. Okay, so hi everyone. I am going to talk a bit about suitability assessment and actual implementation of energy performance contracts. So at Codema, we're currently working on the DeliveREE project, which is a Horizon 2020 funded project, which aims to create a project implementation unit and scalable delivery model that can be replicated across Ireland and Europe, and also to deliver signed energy performance contracts to the value of 20.4 million. So the first step in this, which we have already put in place, is the establishment of the project implementation unit within Codema. The PIU has 5 main staff, but also includes others depending on project needs. So those are Joe as the PIU manager, Shannon as support, and then there's me, myself, Adam and Owen as the team. So this chart shows the project development process and what tasks are involved at a high level in bringing a project from the idea stage all the way through to procurement, and then further on to contract management. So it also shows how the PIU will lead the project development process up until procurement, and then the process passes over to the client after contract signing with support from Codema. So we initially start with a high-level feasibility, and then the client will give an approval to proceed with the project development. And then we move on to a more detailed risk assessment, financial analysis, audit, and then following that, the client will approve the project to proceed to procurement. And then we move on to the procurement process and the contract award and signing. And then following that, there's the works implementation and then a services phase. So the main driver behind the public sector performing energy efficiency upgrades is compliance with emissions targets from the Climate Action Plan. So this figure shows an example gap to 2030 target. So the column on the very left is the original 2016 to 18 baseline. And then the middle column is the 2022 emissions, while the right column is where the organisation needs to be at by 2030. So the blue part represents the indirect emissions, which is electricity, and needs to reduce to the blue stripe section. So this will be taken care of, as Joe mentioned, through emissions reductions on the supply side. So basically the grid getting greener. And the orange and brown parts together make up the direct emissions, which each organisation will have to reduce themselves. So this is where the focus will need to be placed for public sector bodies. So within the PIU, we've developed a building decarbonisation strategy, which aims to identify how an organisation will meet its targets. So we've created an iterative process which involves calculating the existing gap to target, and then looking at their building portfolio and figuring out which buildings can be retrofitted, And then we can kind of, we can sort the pipeline further into the different contract types based on the project size and complexity. And then from there, we can estimate the carbon savings from this pipeline and then go back and make sure it matches the gap to target. And we can keep doing this as the energy use evolves to make sure we're always on track. So there are many non-technical reasons why particular building might not be suitable for EPC. So to go into more detail behind how we decide if a building is suitable for EPC, we can use these 7 questions. So they're not must-haves, but if you can answer each of these, then the project will be more straightforward and attractive to the market. So firstly, is the client the owner of the building? So if not, you may run into issues due to a split incentive between the tenant and the owner. Has the building been renovated in the last 3 years? So if not, it might be too soon to create a baseline, or you may have newly installed equipment that you might want to get more time out of. Will the building be used in the current way for the next 10 years? So if not, it may not be worth implementing measures if, for example, it's going to be demolished. Is the building constantly used and conditioned? So if it's not used constantly, you may not get the value out of the upgrades. Can a baseline be defined? So a baseline of energy consumption at the meter is needed for measurement and verification purposes. Are there existing contracts that will impact the project? So for example, if there's an existing maintenance contract in place, it might be difficult to separate out the EPC measures into a separate contract. And is the energy spend higher than 20K per year? So if not, it may be too small and not worth doing an EPC on, and maybe more suitable for an energy guarantee. So in the figure on the previous slide, we used the energy spend as a high-level predictor of project complexity and separated the buildings out into energy spend. So you can see below 5K, it's probably not worth doing a project on the building. Between 5 to 20K energy spend, it will likely be an energy performance guarantee. Between 20K and 100K, it can be either EPC or energy performance guarantee, and above 100K, it will likely be suitable for an energy performance contract. So these are just, I guess, very high level figures, but it's a way of initially sorting out the buildings to create a kind of initial pipeline. So as a general rule for an EPC project to be attractive to an ESCO, it should have a total energy spend of at least 300K per year. And this can be for an individual building or a whole group of buildings. So, but for a group of buildings, the minimum annual energy spend for any one building should be no less than 20K. So once we have an initial pipeline of buildings for an organisation, then we can plug it back into SEAI's gap to target tool to see how we're tracking against the gap to target. And as mentioned before, the electricity and indirect emissions aren't a priority since they will be reduced by supply side reductions. So this figure is an example gap to target for the direct emissions, which is thermal and transport. So the grey bar labelled 2022 is the existing emissions, and then the striped bar on the right is where they need to get to. So you can see that for this example organisation, we've put in example projects from their pipeline, which include their building retrofits. So this is the most they can really get out of their buildings, and then the remaining is coming from electric vehicles. So now I'll just run through what's involved in the different project types. So for an energy performance contract, the contractor takes on the design, install and maintenance, and therefore the performance and project risks. So it's suitable for holistic building upgrades on larger buildings and involves a competitive dialogue procurement process, which is estimated to take around 9 months. And the contractor installs and provides maintenance, installs the upgrades and provides maintenance, repair and measurement and verification for the service period. So what measures are suitable for EPC? So all active energy systems, and this includes heating systems, electrical systems, ventilation and air conditioning. So by active, I mean that the system needs to be managed, controlled and actively maintained. So if we look at this in terms of most suitable measures for EPC, we're looking at in heating, so heat pumps, heating controls, hot water storage, solar thermal. Then we've got like lighting, solar PV, building management system upgrades, and then for ventilation, air conditioning, control systems, chillers, HVAC ducting, fans, etc. So this doesn't exclude other important measures such as building fabric improvements. It's more that building fabric measures aren't active measures, so they don't require active performance management. So once you install a window or wall installation correctly, then it will perform as expected, whereas heating and ventilation systems require active management and maintenance to ensure maximum efficiency. And fabric measures also generally have a much longer payback period, and so may require the client to add extra funding to the project. So this is an example EPC project. It was the first EPC we did with Dublin City Council, and it began with a request from the Ballymun Leisure Centre to help develop a specification for a CHP. And then we decided to take the opportunity to float the idea of an EPC with DCC, and they saw the benefits and asked us to develop a business case. So these are kind of the main contract terms. So the contract duration was 8 years, initial capital investment of 670,000 euros, and then a potential cost savings of 165,000 euros. A potential annual energy savings of 38%, and then that translates to 639 tonnes of carbon dioxide savings per year. So this shows the measurement and verification results from the project. So this orange line above here is the baseline of electricity consumption. So basically what the electricity consumption would have been if the project wasn't implemented. And then the blue line here is the actual electricity consumption. So the area between the two lines is the savings. So that's electricity, and then this is gas. So similar thing, the blue line above is the baseline, and the orange line below is the existing measured consumption. So the area between the lines is the savings, and you can see that gas consumption really correlates with the heating degree days, which is the dotted line. So the key findings from this EPC, the EPC is operating as expected with an average of 42% savings. It's reduced overall costs by almost a third, and DCC are on track to save 1.5 million over the contract term while having an asset fully maintained. So moving on to the energy guarantee. So this would use a standard works contract with a performance clause added as a schedule. So the contractor takes on the performance risk of the equipment, and the client withholds a small percentage of the final payment, which will be paid dependent on performance after a specified period. And in this case, an external M&E design consultant and construction manager may be required depending on the project complexity. So this is an example energy guarantee project, so a heat pump project where the designer and contractor would guarantee a COP of, for example, 3.2, and the client would withhold 7.5% of the fees until the end of the measurement period, which is a year in this case. And so for every 5% efficiency above a COP of 3.2, a bonus payment of 1.5% is paid. And then likewise for any 5% efficiency below COP of 3.2, a penalty payment would be applied. And then this is another example of a simple lighting retention. So it's a retention, 10% retention of the final payment until the following conditions are satisfied. So before and after measurements of electricity consumption to demonstrate the energy savings. That could be a simple spot check. And then the contractor to replace all the faulty fittings at its own cost for the first year of operation. Yeah, so that's all from me. I've just put a link there to our community of best practice, which I guess gives updates on the DeliveREE project. So you can sign up to that there, and we'll also send the slides around, and that will include a link. So I'll pass on to Aaron now, who's going to be talking about the energy contracting support scheme.
Thanks, Emily. And I'll just try and share my screen now. So, Emily, you might let me know if you can see that.
Yep, I can see that.
Yep, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Aaron Quigley. I'm a program executive with SEAI, and I'm one of the people involved in administration of our energy contracting support scheme, which was set up last year as to provide funding support for interested organisations who might be looking at EPCs for a way of decarbonising. So I'm going to chat a bit about the purpose of the ECSS grant. I'm going to talk a bit then about eligibility for receiving funding support, the funding amounts, the application process, the award criteria in which we evaluate applications. And then at the end, I'm going to chat a bit about the role of the EPC facilitator, which is essentially what Joe and Emily have been describing, the role that Codema performed with DCC, and some training that SEAI are rolling out at the moment to train people up to take on this role and these responsibilities. So the purpose of the Energy Contracting Support Scheme is to help organisations from either the public or the private sector who are looking to achieve decarbonisation or energy savings through the implementation of energy performance contracts. It's, as mentioned, it's available to organisations within the public or private sector, but it's not available to the residential sector. And the aim of this particular grant is to do with external consultancy costs. So it's very, organisations will likely, in many cases, not have in-house expertise or be familiar with EPC. So we're aiming to help them to offset some of the costs associated with outsourcing that technical, legal or financial expertise. So it could be described as a grant for brains rather than bricks. The type of contracts that are eligible for this support are the EPCs and energy performance guarantees, which have both been covered in quite a bit of detail by Emily and Joe, but also a local energy supply contract, which is an agreement to supply energy, typically heat or electricity, to a site using a local energy generator. So we see this with the likes of biomass. With these type of contracts, the contractor or ESCO generally finances the installation works and then is paid directly by the client for the quantity of energy supplied over an agreed time period. The types of project eligible for the grant are deep energy retrofit, packages that would comprise of multiple project elements and or technologies. As Joe mentioned in his presentation, the kind of bundling of buildings, different projects, and also projects which are set projects on a course to net zero. We're particularly interested in projects that will increase the knowledge base for EPC development in Ireland. Eligible activities would be the likes of preliminary energy audits, feasibility studies, and contract suitability testing, and that ties into some of what Emily has just presented there. Specialist reports, business case development, and evaluation of different procurement options. The support levels available from SEAI are up to 75% of the eligible costs. And that's to a maximum of 50,000 for EPCs or local energy supply contracts. And then there's a cap of 25,000 for an energy performance guarantee, which is the traditional contracts with an inserted clause around energy savings. The costs are awarded up to the costs are available up to contract award only, and the drawdown is you need to get to the point of contractor appointment in order to draw down the funding support. There are full details on how to apply on our ECSS webpage, and there'll be a link provided here in these slides that are circulated. It's pretty straightforward, and there's a direct upload system, which you can also download a user guide on how to use that. What we'll be looking for is a completed ECSS application form, and that has it's an Excel spreadsheet which requires input of project details, tax clearance information, some of the expected or estimated energy savings. We're also looking for a number of declarations to be completed. That's de minimis, ECSS eligibility, and also commitment to financial resourcing the project. And where required, we need a letter of VAT exemption. So again, all these documents can be downloaded directly from the ECSS webpage, and then, as I said, when they're completed, they can be uploaded to our PEP portal. When we receive the application details, we take about 6 weeks to turn them around, and we assess them on the basis of a number of criteria. So firstly, we're looking at commitment and capability. So we need to know that senior management are on board. We need to know that there's a commitment to funding, and that the project is suitable and intended to be delivered through a pay per performance type contract. We're also interested in the quality and the ambition of the scope and the objectives, and the level of savings, carbon and energy savings, to be achieved. We're, as I mentioned earlier, interested in innovation and in this area, ways of adding to the knowledge base, and looking to support organisations who are willing to test out the ambitions of EPC, yeah, we want to be involved with ambitious projects if possible, because we can learn a lot from them. And there needs to be a commitment demonstrated as well to release an invitation to tender within 15 months of receiving a letter of offer from SEAI. I'll move then on to the EPC facilitator role. So I think from Joe and Emily's presentation, people, everybody should have a reasonably good idea of the importance of a facilitator, particularly in Ireland, we're not so familiar with these new energy performance contracts. So it's a kind of an in-between person between the contractor or the ESCO and the client organisation. So really the facilitator comes on board at a very early stage and starts out by doing what Emily demonstrated, which is assessing project suitability, maybe for a single building or for a portfolio of buildings, looking at the potential energy savings, initial technical analysis, maybe that might follow from an energy audit. And then they continue with the client throughout the process into the preparation of tender documentation, and then through the procurement process and the negotiation and dialogue with the ESCOs as they start to bid. And then right up to contract award, they're there to kind of do a little bit of hand holding and provide advice and guidance for the client. So in order to sort of upskill people in this area, in the industry, SEAI are rolling out EPC facilitator training. So we started this last year, and Joe and Emily have been delivering it for us. It's a 2-day training course delivered in our offices on Hatch Street in Dublin city centre. It's freely available to anybody involved in as an energy professional. We have our next course scheduled for September of this year, hopefully when everyone's back from their holidays and with their batteries recharged. And we're looking at mid-September, and anybody who's interested in taking part in that course can contact me on my details, which will be in these slides, and I'll put your name down. The intention going forward, and it'll likely be the beginning of next year, is that in SEAI we're going to be setting up a register of EPC facilitators, and it will become a prerequisite for the ECSS grant that organisations bring on board a register facilitator to see them through the implementation of an EPC and to get that funding support. These slides will include just a summary overview of the 8 modules that are delivered over the 2 days training, and you can take a look at them at your leisure. And then finally, I have my email address and direct contact number here at the end of my slides for anybody who might have queries on the training course or might wish to put their name forward. And that's it. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thanks very much, Aaron. I think we have a quick Slido. Ellie, if you're able to share. And we're just approaching 1 o'clock. That's about it. Might be my fault for ad-libbing too much. Sorry, Ellie.
The Slido link is now in the chat box.
Okay.
And I'll share my screen now as well.
And I think there will also be when Ellie, you share your screen, there will be a QR code as well. Yeah, so if you want, you can just point your camera at the QR code and it'll bring it there as well. Interesting words coming in already. Easy, very good. I'd like to see that. We'll just give people a couple of more minutes anyway. You can see people typing at the top, so yeah. It's nice to see necessary coming out. It's good and sensible. It's all quite positive. Ellie, we'll be able to save these results as well, don't we? Yeah. Good. Conflict is an interesting one to see. I suppose there's always a tension between the different people, but yeah. Okay, that's really good. There's 23 people coming in there. Oh, one more. Yeah, we'll just give it another minute and then we'll move on. And if anybody has any comments, feel free to either type in the box or open your mic. I have to say you've all been very well behaved with your microphones now. There has been no interference noises coming through anyway. So okay, that's really good. Yeah. So yeah, I think we only have 3 questions anyway. So and maybe while you're answering that, there was one question that came in on the chat earlier from Adrian about how can EPC and energy performance guarantees be included practically in a request for tender. So I suppose just to answer that, the energy performance guarantee is quite straightforward in that the first thing is it's just an additional clause in an existing contract. So when we trialed it with a boiler project a couple of years ago, we used it as an additional clause in the CWMF capital works framework contracts, the short form contract. We were able to include an extra schedule in that outlined the guarantee. And then in terms of the procurement, it was for a boiler efficiency. So that was, I think from memory, we just had the minimum efficiency required as a pass fail in the evaluation criteria, but you can you basically would reflect the contract in the evaluation or award criteria for the projects. That's relatively simple. For the performance contracting, as Emily pointed out, we use the competitive dialogue procedure, and the reason for that is that it allows us to have an output led procurement procedure. So we would specify, minimum carbon reduction requirements or energy efficiency requirements. You would shortlist 3 companies generally, and then they would come out, carry out audits and propose what measures they would install to meet your solutions. And you kind of go through that competitive dialogue or interview process. And then at the end of that, you would finalize your tender document, and it starts to look like more of a normal competition at that stage. But that's all covered in the training program that Aaron outlined. I think we have a full 2 or 3 hour presentation on procurement and another 2 or 3 hour one on contracting. So it's all there. Okay, so it's really good to see whole building carbonisation coming out on top. So hopefully EPC will be of interest there. And then if we want to move on to the next one, the last one. But we'll now, very good. Actively considering